Hepatitis B surface antigen, if somebody has got positivity serologically, then what are the various nephrological problems with which they can be associated? Membranous glomerulopathy with nephrotic syndrome like presentation, if somebody has got, it is a norm in adults to also get his viral profile done, because sometimes serologically hepatitis B surface antigen positivity correlates with a membranous glomerulopathy pathology in the kidney presenting itself as a nephrotic syndrome. Similarly, membranoproliferative glomerulonephritis can be there in a otherwise asymptomatic hepatitis B surface antigen positive individual. Similarly, IgA nephropathy, polyarteritis nodosa, essential mixed cryoglobulinemia can be associated with hepatitis B positivity. I will give you a classical case study. A patient presenting with history of malaise and skin ulceration, and within a short period of time he developed ulnar nerve palsy, median nerve palsy, and also a foot drop. So we were thinking as a physician, what could explain all these pathologies? Can you explain by one single possibility, doctor? Multiple nerve paralysis along with skin ulceration in a patient presenting with malaise and weakness. So typically hepatitis B serologically was positive, and all these were the manifestations of vasculitis which is initiated by the hepatitis B surface antigen positivity. So that's the reason, doctor, always any patient presents with mononeuritis multiplex or with a vasculitis with multiple neurological complications, you should always look for hepatitis C, hepatitis B seropositivity, because hepatitis B can lead to mixed cryoglobulinemia or a polyarteritis nodosa, which can present with a vasculitis leading to the ischemia of the multiple nerves in the form of mononeuritis multiplex is what you need to basically understand. IV immunoglobulin, one of the favorite topics of examiner, no doubt we will have a question in the next sentence also. What are the various indications? Some of them are off-label indications, some are FDA approved indications of IV immunoglobulin. Fundamentally, why we want to give IV immunoglobulin ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, doctor? Why platelets are getting destroyed in ITP? Because there is a autoantibodies generated against the platelets which are wrongly recognizing the one's own platelets as foreign. We want to step down the procedure by stepping down all those autoantibodies which are not required anyway. So it is the modulation of the complement activation is what the IVIG will be doing. Similarly, all the idiotypic antibodies it will be suppressing, and it will be antagonizing the FC receptors on the macrophages. There are the multitude of pleiotropic actions of IVIG, which is a wonderful immunomodulating agent with a lot of applications is what need to be remembered. We use IVIG in the management of ITP, but in every case of ITP do you want to use IVIG, doctor? Generally a patient with platelet low count will come to you with ITP as diagnosis. Steroids are the first thing which is being initiated. Then what else you will do? You will give hydrocortisone 100 milligrams TID intravenously and look for a suppression of that thrombocytopenia. Suppose if it is not resolving, you can try azathioprine, vincristine, etc., which are also immunosuppressives in ITP. Still it is not resolving, especially if it is an acute ITP. Let us say there is a cerebral hemorrhage, or any organ is showing the presence of hemorrhage with ITP, that is the indication for IV immunoglobulin in the management of the ITP. Similarly, Kawasaki's disease, dermatomyositis, there are other important scenarios. So how does ITP, IV immunoglobulin help there? In Kawasaki disease, a lot of membrane attack complexes, which are the part of the terminal component of the complement pathway, they form excessively. The formation of this membrane attack complexes is decreased by giving the IV immunoglobulin. So that is another important application of IVIG. So tell doctor quickly 6 important FDA approved indications of IVIG, like a parrot you must answer in tomorrow's exam. Any primary immunodeficiency, similarly immune mediated thrombocytopenia ITP, Kawasaki, And similarly in the hematopoietic stem cell transplantation in the patients who are more than 20 years of age, and if there is any chronic B cell lymphocytic leukemia also, CLL, there is an application of IVIG, and similarly in pediatrics in HIV type 1 infection, these are the 6 important specific indications. Off-label, does neurologists also use the IVIG? Very much. Somebody comes with myasthenia gravis. What is after all the problem of myasthenia gravis? Antibodies are formed against the postsynaptic receptors. That is the whole problem. It's called Eaton-Lambert otherwise, if it is proximal to that, antibodies. So you want to step down that tendency. So you can use it in myasthenia gravis, Lambert-Eaton type of myasthenic syndrome also. In Guillain-Barré syndrome you can use multiple sclerosis also, it finds an application, and CIDP, chronic inflammatory demyelinating neuropathy, but they are all the off-label indications not approved by the FDA, but still we use the IV immunoglobulin. Now let us talk about ANCA. Now I think you have recognized the importance of the vasculitis, vaginous, Churg-Strauss, polyarteritis nodosa, giant cell arteritis. You must be encyclopedic about these important topics. Invariably one question comes on them. So where do you come across ANCA? But before that, I like to give you a short case presentation. The best way to get a leverage in reading medicine, or for that matter all clinical subjects, is if you have a clinical correlation that actually makes the whole process interesting. 78-year-old woman presents to the emergency because she has a decreased urine output. Lower extremity swelling is there and malaise is there. She says that I am having sinusitis for the past 2 months, which had been variably treated with ciprofloxacin. Is there any relationship between sinusitis, upper respiratory tract involvement, and the hematuria and the decreased renal function? There can be, if it is any connective tissue disorder. And also she says, I look little different, doctor, from what I regularly look like. What is the reason? Because she has got a prominent depression of her nose because of the collapse of her nasal bridge. Possibly this is because of the necrosis due to the vasculitis, which is involving the nasal septum, which can occur very much in certain connective tissue disorders. Urine analysis of her shows proteinuria 4+ is really a very bad state. ANCA positivity was also there, but the anti-glomerular basement membrane antibody is negative. And when the renal biopsy, because she is having proteinuria, renal biopsy was done, it is showing the presence of the crescent formation in the glomerulus, which is a very characteristic feature. So the positive serology of the ANCA with the upper respiratory tract involvement, with the renal involvement, with the crescent formation, with the rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis, with a 4+ proteinuria, you should think of the possibility of the vaginous granulomatosis, which is the vasculitic state, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Within the ANCA you have the perinuclear and the cytoplasmic. So C-ANCA and P-ANCA, out of the two, C-ANCA is much more specific for the vaginous, whereas the P-ANCA is the one which is found in the microscopic polyangiitis, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now the question is, out of the vasculitis in polyarteritis nodosa, do you come across the ANCA positivity? Generally it is rarer compared to that of vaginous, Churg-Strauss, etc., etc. Finding it positive in the PAN is less likely. So around 20% of the patients will also show the anti-glomerular, I mean those who have a good posture like anti-glomerular basement membrane disease, they will also show the ANCA positivity, especially if a good posture patient shows ANCA positivity, it portends a poor prognosis. Generally you don't expect ANCA to be positive in a GBM disease patient like good posture, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now let us talk about the systemic lupus erythematosus. Do you come across autoimmune hemolytic anemia? Very much. What is Evans syndrome, doctor? Evans syndrome, where you find both ITP along with autoimmune hemolytic anemia. The combination is called Evans syndrome. Sometimes Evans can be coexistent with a SLE-like state also. Then there is an increased ANA, which is the sensitive and a screening test for the SLE, anti-dsDNA, which is the confirmatory, and there can sometimes be SLE, can be a part of the mixed connective tissue disorder, where rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's syndrome, SLE, all of them can coexist. Then it is called as MTCD, MCTD, mixed connective tissue disorder is what we have to basically remember. So what type of arthritis do you come across in SLE? Unlike the osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, etc., where erosions may be there, but erosions are never a feature of SLE. Is it a good differential diagnosis or an important differential diagnosis? Definitely. Rheumatoid arthritis is a diagnosis that you tend to make in a 30 or 35-year-old female who has got early morning stiffness. Even the SLE also is made in the young females between 25 to 35 years of age group, who also present with similar clinical features and who has got pericarditis, a kind of diffuse parasternal pain, has presented even with joint pains. So rheumatoid arthritis management is totally different from that of the SLE management. And the good news is rheumatoid arthritis can be deforming, whereas SLE arthritis is non-erosive and non-deforming. So take a radiograph of her hands and you find erosions, it is equivalent to rheumatoid, and it is non-erosive, more likely to be SLE with ANA positivity. So that is a very important differentiating factor between the two. Now let us talk about the HIV. So invariably without a question on HIV there can't be a question paper at all. So Kaposi's, non-Hodgkin's, Hodgkin's, multiple myeloma, leukemia, melanoma, any of them can be considered as the AIDS associated neoplasms is what I like to underscore to all of you. So all of them have a tendency to increase in the HIV positive individual. CDC has defined only 4 neoplasms to be definitely associated with HIV. What are they? Typically it is the Kaposi, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, primary lymphoma of the CNS, and invasive cervical carcinoma. These are the 4 neoplasms which are identified definitely associated with HIV according to the CDC. Now I give you an opportunity to quickly review what is that movie, doctor, where you have all Kaposi's lesions. It's an award winning movie where the hero shows serial appearance of Philadelphia. Was the movie you didn't see? Okay. So sometimes we should see movies also, doctor. So HIV patient typically in that the hero actually has a history of homosexuality, gay. So he is otherwise a eminent advocate by himself, attorney, and he develops a serial appearance of who is that hero's name? I am not able to recall. Huh? Tom Hanks. Very good. So it's a wonderful movie which speaks about Kaposi sarcoma. So typically asymptomatic growths that are flat, purple red, which are nodular in appearance, is a classical feature. In the case of the Kaposi is what need to be remembered. Down syndrome. In obstetrics you have Downs, in pediatrics Downs, adult medicine also Downs. So you have to be, and radiology very important. Downs, lot of questions come on it. So you have the mental and physical retardation, flat facies will be there. It is not anti-mongoloid slant. Sometimes in exam we tend to tick it and then later come and regret. Little slowly we have to read the questions. It is the upward slant which is the mongoloid, not the anti-mongoloid slant. Epicanthal folds will be there, oblique palpebral fissure, and a flat nasal bridge and a brachycephaly, which is where the skull is small, clinodactyly, and a distal triradius and preponderance of the ulnar loops on the fingers, hypotonia, simian crease. They are all the important telltale signs. What do you mean by clinodactyly, doctor? It is the curvature, curved finger. So you can see here the little finger is curved. Clinodactyly is a feature of Down syndrome. And also you can see the presence of the simian crease, hyperextensible joints. Similarly between the big toe and the second toe, if you take, the space become increased in the case of the Down syndrome is another important feature. Now why for a cardiologist Downs is important? Endocardial cushion defects are more common. So ostium primum ASD, AV valvular malformations, etc. For a gastroenterologist, why it is important? Because ileal and jejunal atresia, tracheoesophageal fistula, Hirschsprung's disease, Meckel's diverticulum, imperforate annus and omphalocele, they are all more common in the case of the Downs. Brushfield spots are the ones which are found in the iris and there is an increased risk of cataract, nystagmus and squint, and most important AML, ALL, they are typically increased in a patient with the Downs, and a pre-senile dementia, Alzheimer's, also is more common in the case of the Downs, is what we need to basically remember. Conn syndrome. So these are all traditional topics which you have to master in no time. Any number of questions we solve. Basically excess aldosteronism can be primary or it can be secondary. Primary means you can see, doctor, these are the two kidneys. Now this is the adrenal adenoma which is located on in the suprarenal gland of the other kidney. So typically unilateral adrenal gland adenoma like this is the one which is responsible for the primary hyperaldosteronism. Now what is secondary hyperaldosteronism? Suppose if I have congestive heart failure, then the renal perfusion decreases because my heart is unable to pump sufficient blood to the kidney. So decreased renal perfusion will stimulate the renin. Renin produces aldosterone, that also leads to rise of aldosterone. So there is a reason any hypovolemic state, cardiac failure or any edema or cirrhosis of liver, ascites, they all can lead to a intravascular volume contraction which will stimulate the kidney to produce a renin and later on aldosterone. That's the reason it is called secondary hyperaldosteronism. That is the reason, doctor, in any patient who has got hypertension and showing presence of hypernatremia with hypokalemia and the presence of metabolic alkalosis, do you like to immediately consider the possible diagnosis of Conn syndrome? It is justified that we can suspect. Why? Because there is a hypernatremia. Hypokalemia means lot of aldosterone is causing that, sodium retention, potassium loss, and the same aldosterone is also causing H plus loss, hence there is a metabolic alkalosis. Same aldosterone is causing vasoconstriction, hypertension is there. But do you like to consider Conn syndrome in all such scenarios? No. Most important thing before you consider Conn is whether it is a primary hyperaldosteronism or secondary. So check the hydration, is he dehydrated? Check for the edema, he is not edematous. Only if he is euvolemic and no secondary causes for a possible hyperaldosteronism are there, then only in a case of hypertension with hypokalemia, with hypernatremia, with metabolic alkalosis, you should consider the possibility of the Conn syndrome. Another important differentiating factor, frequent question in the exam, how are the renin levels in the case of secondary hyperaldosteronism? Naturally decreased perfusion in a edematous individual will stimulate the kidney to produce more renin. So high renin is equal to secondary hyperaldosteronism, whereas a low renin is what you typically see in primary hyperaldosteronism, because aldosterone will go and reflexly make the renin to become shut down, is another important differentiating factor between the two. Now let's go to the next question. Osteoblastic secondaries. What are the important malignancies which are notorious to cause? Prostate, thyroid, breast, they are all very notorious, a short case presentation. 70-year-old male with a history of the prostate cancer, and if prostate cancer is there and there is a fragility of bones, how do you evaluate such a case, doctor? Immediately get a radionuclide scan done to detect for the presence of those blastic metastases. Unless a metastasis is blastic, the radionuclide scan doesn't become positive. Do you find increased radionuclide scan uptake in multiple myeloma? No. Why? Because in multiple myeloma it is an osteoclastic activity, not blastic activity. Unless multiple myeloma led to fractures and fractures are healing and that led to osteoblast proliferation, then only multiple myeloma will pick up the radionuclide scan increased uptake. Otherwise, radionuclide scan by principle in multiple myeloma is normal. It can be used to diagnose, is what you need to basically remember. Whereas in the case of the prostate cancer, with the osteoblastic metastasis, you are able to find the presence of an increased radionuclide uptake, which is a very classical feature because they are all the blastic metastasis. Now let us talk about hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis, one of the favorite topic of the examiner. Very simple, we have an anion gap. It can either remain normal or it can become increased. There are only two ways by which metabolic acidosis is looked at. Now hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis is also called a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Now why hyperchloremia should be there if there is an acidosis is a first fundamental question. Acidosis means what, doctor? It can occur because of two reasons. Either H plus ion is too much in the blood or bicarbonate is too less in the blood. The second state is true about hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. It is the low bicarbonate in the serum with the loss of bicarbonate into the urine is responsible for hyperchloremic acidosis. But don't agree with me. Why? Because we only have had been half the way to the seduction, because we are not still clear why it is. Why should low bicarbonate should cause hyperchloremia? There is a competition between bicarbonate and chloride to catch the bus in the tubule. When both of them are passing through the tubular fluid, bicarbonate says I want to go in, chloride says no, I want to go. Who will sit first? That is what we used to fight in our school bus days, right? Even today possibly in medical college bus days also. So now the question is, when there is a low bicarb state, there is no competition for the chloride available in the tubule to compete. No, bicarbonate itself is there. So more chloride become reabsorbed, and that lead to a hyperchloremic state. So that is the reason, doctor, a low bicarbonate is equivalent to an acidosis with a hyperchloremic state is what we need to basically understand because of the lack of competition. Now, if there is more chloride, why should anion gap should become normal? What is normal anion gap? How do you calculate? It is sodium plus potassium minus bicarbonate plus chloride. So if bicarbonate is low, same time chloride is high, there is no change. It is compensating. The fall of bicarbonate is compensated by rise of chloride. So the sodium plus potassium minus bicarbonate plus chloride value doesn't change. That is the reason it is called normal anion gap metabolic acidosis is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now what are the causes for this kind of situation? Bicarbonate would have been lost from the gastrointestinal tract. If we vomit, do we lose bicarbonate, or if we pass diarrhea we lose it? More often from the lower part of the GIT. So diarrhea, external drainage of any pancreas, biliary or small bowel juices, because they are all bicarbonate rich and they are drained out of the body. That is another reason for the fall of the bicarbonate. Similarly, ureter and sigmoid colon, if you happen to combine that by a stomy, ureterosigmoidostomy, all the sigmoids rich bicarbonate secretions are drained through the ureter into the urine, and that's how the individual is losing the bicarbonate. That is another important state. And ileal loop conduit, because small intestine contains a lot of bicarbonate rich secretions. If you happen to open out the ileostomy, that also can make bicarbonate to be lost. Similarly, kidney can lose the bicarbonate. Normally in which part of the kidney is the bicarbonate reabsorption occur, doctor? Proximal renal tubule. Suppose if the individual has got a type 2 RTA with a proximal tubular dysfunction with Fanconi's anemia, he is not reabsorbing the bicarbonate properly. Possibility 1. Second possibility, who is important for the bicarbonate to be reabsorbed in the proximal renal tubule, doctor? We require one enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. If I use a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor like acetazolamide, bicarbonate reabsorption in the proximal tubule is lost. So bicarbonate is lost into urine, and that is another important reason it can lead to development of this kind of normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Similarly, if you happen to to give more amount of fluids to the individual, too much of fluids, just like dehydration leads to metabolic alkalosis. Why? Dehydration, intravascular volume contraction stimulate aldosterone renin, and that causes sodium retention, potassium loss, H plus loss of H plus leads to metabolic alkalosis, right? That means dehydration leads to metabolic alkalosis. What is the reverse of that? Overhydration should lead to naturally acidosis. But why we will overhydrate an individual? Suppose let us say you have a diabetic ketoacidosis patient. Diabetic ketoacidosis with lot of ketone bodies in the plasma, what type of metabolic acidosis is it called, doctor? High anion gap metabolic acidosis. A diabetic ketoacidosis patient, how do you treat him? You will dump as much saline as possible. Normal saline you will dump because you need to treat his dehydration. All the saline that you have dumped will lead to a lot of chloride which is there in the saline to reach the renal tubules, and all that chloride become reabsorbed into the plasma, and that also leads to a hyperchloremic state which can lead to metabolic acidosis. That is a favorite question of the examiner. A untreated case of dehydrated diabetic ketoacidosis is what type of acidosis? High anion gap metabolic acidosis. And that DKA patient, after being treated with a lot of saline pumped into his body, will land in a hyperchloremic normal anion gap metabolic acidosis state, is what you have to clearly understand. Then how do you treat that? Suppose your patient with DKA with a high anion gap metabolic acidosis is paraded to you, and you have started saline therapy, and afterwards you have once more checked the anion gap, it turned out to be normal anion gap acidosis. Do you want to do something for that? Nothing. The moment you stop saline infusion, even normal anion gap acidosis also will be gone. There is no special treatment which is required for it. Then there is another important entity called hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism state, which also can lead to a hyperchloremic normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. Let us talk about it. Can you tell me which subset of patients can have this entity? Suppose I have diabetes and I have a diabetic nephropathy. If there is a diabetic nephropathy, what will happen? Kidneys, macula densa, juxtaglomerular apparatus, they all become damaged. That is the site for production of renin. So diabetic nephropathy leads to a loss of renin production. If there is no renin, there is no aldosterone. If there is no aldosterone, nobody can retain sodium. So what will happen? Sodium will be lost. Nobody to retain, to lose potassium and H plus. So potassium and H plus become retained. So that also leads to development of acidosis. So a hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism due to the diabetic nephropathy is a classical example of, once more, a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, and this hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism state is also called as type 4 renal tubular acidosis, is what you need to basically remember. Similarly, those drugs which are typically used, which are aldosterone antagonists, for example potassium sparing diuretics like spironolactone, similarly trimethoprim, pentamidine, NSAIDs, they all can typically cause tubular damage, and that also will lead to a renin production become impaired, and that also can lead to hypoaldosterone state, and that can lead to later on to the development of normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, which is hyperchloremic. Quickly summarize, doctor. Broadly, hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis with normal anion gap can be caused by either gastrointestinal causes where bicarbonate is lost, or it can be a renal cause. Among the renal causes, it can be a proximal tubular causes or distal tubular causes. Among the proximal tubular causes, you have the type 2 renal tubular acidosis, similarly carbonic anhydrase inhibitor administration, and among the distal renal tubular causes, you have the hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism state of diabetic nephropathy, and also you have spironolactone like drugs which are antagonizing aldosterone. Anything that makes aldosterone low will cause a will lead to hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis state, is what we have to clearly understand. Now let us go to the next question. But before this, I like to ask you a question. Anyway, the context has come. Renal tubular acidosis, we say type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is distal, type 2 is proximal. Once more a paradox in English, right? Now, what is the difference between the two? Why acidosis is there in the case of the proximal renal tubular dysfunction? In proximal renal tubular dysfunction, there is type 2. Bicarbonate is not reabsorbed, hence it is lost, so bicarbonatenuria is leading to development of acidosis. That is the underlying pathology. Then why there is an acidosis in the case of distal renal tubular pathology? If the distal renal tubule is damaged, normally what is the function of distal renal tubule? All the H plus ions in our plasma, they are combined with NH3. So NH4 plus become created in the distal renal tubule and NH4 plus is lost into urine. That is how the distal renal tubule secretes the H plus ion and makes us to get rid of H plus ion from the body. So if the distal renal tubule lost its ability to acidify the urine and ability to capture the H plus in the form of NH4 plus and lose it in urine, then also H plus become retained in the plasma and that leads to development of distal renal tubular acidosis. So we must be very clear about these two mechanisms. Now tell me doctor, only one question is asked in entrance. What is the single most important test that differentiates proximal RTA from distal RTA? If you know that you are through the topic of RTA in the exam. The most important factor that we need to remember when it comes to the proximal RTA is there is a point until which this bicarbonatenuria occurs. In proximal RTA what is happening? Bicarbonate is not reabsorbed and lost into urine, right? Only until a point this bicarbonatenuria occurs. What does it mean? It means to say that only until the serum bicarbonate is until 15 milliequivalents per liter. Normally serum bicarbonate will be until how many milliequivalents? 25 to 30 milliequivalents, let us put it that way. So until it comes down until 15 milliequivalents per liter, kidney will be losing bicarbonate. The moment the serum bicarbonate falls below 15 milliequivalents, then though the proximal renal tubule is abnormal, still it won't lose the bicarbonate, it will reabsorb it. That means the bicarbonatenuria that you come across in the urine can only occur only until the serum bicarbonate levels are greater than 15 milliequivalents per liter. It is a very important feature in the case of proximal RTA. You can easily remember it is a spendthrift until the purse is full. Purse is lost, it won't pick up the other's purse and also start spending. That is not the nature of proximal RTA. So whereas if you take the distal RTA, at any given point of time it is conservative. That means it will never lose bicarbonate because the problem is not with losing the bicarbonate, the problem is with the distal acidification process. So that is the reason doctor, in the case of the proximal RTA, the urine pH can be lowered to less than 5.5 if you happen to give the acid, but you can never lower the urinary pH less than 5.5 in the case of the distal RTA because the very process of acidification is abnormal in the distal renal tubular acidosis is a differentiating factor between the two. So how can you check that? Give ammonium chloride, NH4Cl, load the patient. Look whether urine pH will fall below 5.5 or not. If at all urine pH can fall below 5.5, that means it is the proximal RTA. It can never fall means it is more likely to be distal RTA. So ammonium chloride loading test is a way to differentiate between the two, is what we need to basically remember. Now here we need to talk a little more before we say goodbye to RTA. Do you find hypokalemia in distal RTA or do you find hyperkalemia? See, distal RTA can be of two types. Basically RTA is of four types, type 1, 2 and 4, more important. Type 1 is distal, type 2 is proximal, type 4 also once more pathology is distal because there is no renin production in type 4. So there is a reason we can divide the distal RTA into type 1 is a distal RTA, even type 4 also is a distal RTA. How to differentiate between the two? Typically the type 4 type of distal RTA is one where in addition to the acidosis you also find hyperkalemia, whereas in the case of the type 1 type of distal RTA, which is also a distal RTA, you find hypokalemia. Now tell me doctor, why hyperkalemia will be found in type 4 type of distal RTA? Because type 4 type of distal RTA we said hyporeninemic hypoaldosteronism, Aldosterone is required for sodium retention and potassium loss. No aldosterone means potassium is not lost, it is retained. That leads to hyperkalemia, which is a differentiating feature between type 1 and type 4 type of RTA. So both of them are basically distal renal tubular pathologies is what you need to basically understand. So peace with RTA. There are few topics which we should confuse and pose that we still understood, because after winning entrance also I still remember the first case of RTA I have seen only in second year posting, second year of MD. The challenge was patient is having recurrent bone fractures. RTA case I have not first time seen in medicine department in acute medical care, I have seen in orthopedic department. Recurrent bone fractures are there. No one is able to understand why he is having like that. At any given point of time the calcium loss is very high, and incidentally on estimation of anion gap, it is a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis that the patient is having. Then on further probing, ammonium chloride loading, urinary anion gap calculation, then you will come across the conclusion that it is a case of RTA. That's the reason, doctor, we understand a little in third year, final year housemanship during entrance preparation. Finally only when you see the case, treat it, make him better, then only you are actually achieving the goal. So don't worry if you have not answered the questions correctly in spite of all the reading in the book, because at the end of reading the book we feel satiety, we feel very energetic, but we may fail in exam because some link will be missing, no problem. Now let us talk about the anion gap acidosis. Already we discussed diabetic ketoacidosis, similarly the ethylene glycol poisoning and the acute renal failure with uremia. They are all the examples of a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. Diuretics, is it a high anion gap or a normal anion gap acidosis? Just before we reviewed, na? Carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, if you give, what will happen? It will prevent carbonic anhydrase from bicarbonate reabsorption. So bicarbonate is lost into urine, leading to bicarbonatenuria, which is similar to proximal RTA. Hence it is a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. It can't be a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. It leads to high anion gap metabolic acidosis only if either lactic acid or ketone acid or uremic acid, any of the acid is excessively accumulating in the body, then only it leads to high anion gap metabolic acidosis is what we have to basically remember. So another common question, invariably one question comes here, is mechanism of action of diuretics. You must be doubly sure. Proximal renal tubule is the place where carbonic anhydrase inhibitors are functioning. Then you are having the distal tubule where the thiazide diuretics are functioning. Then thick ascending limb of loop of Henle is the place where loop diuretics are functioning. How about the osmotic diuretics, doctor? All the three places. They act in proximal tubule, they also act in the descending limb of loop of Henle, and also they act at the level of the distal tubule, osmotic diuretics like mannitol, etc. Then you have potassium sparing diuretics like spironolactone, which once more go and function at the level of the distal tubule. So that is how the diuretics, where is the mechanism of action, which diuretics leads to alkalosis, acidosis, and which diuretics lead to hypokalemia, hypercalcemia. You must be having those things in the tips. Now let us quickly go to the next question. Oxalate crystals in the urine, typically where do you come across? This kind of needle shaped enveloped calcium oxalate crystals are typically found in the case of the ethylene glycol poisoning is what we need to basically understand. Celiac disease is another common topic, many times we discussed in our Sunday tests. So we need to remember dermatitis herpetiformis is the cutaneous correlate of a underlying autoimmune disorder of celiac disease. Similarly, type 1 diabetes, lymphoma, atrophic gastritis, all of them celiac disease patients present themselves, can be have an association. Now how does a celiac patient present himself, doctor? He is emaciated, malabsorption is there. That's how he goes to a gastroenterologist, or sometimes he can land with a dermatologist because of the dermatitis herpetiformis lesions. So you have a symptomatic celiac, silent celiac and latent celiac. The moment it becomes symptomatic, inflamed small intestine is there, and which HLA association does celiac disease show, doctor? It is the DQ2 and DQ8 is the one where the genetic susceptibility association will be found. So dermatitis herpetiformis, pancreatic insufficiency, type 1 diabetes, T-cell lymphomas, Addison's, Graves, myasthenia, scleroderma, Sjogren, atrophic gastritis with pernicious anemia, any of them can be the features in the case of the autoimmune phenomena which we see in the case of the celiac. Now how does a normal jejunal mucosa look like? Where is the problem in the celiac, doctor? Small intestine, jejunum will show villous atrophy. That is the whole problem for them. So here you can see the lower half of the crypts will show undifferentiated cells which are having a very high mitotic rate. This is a normal histology which our first year MBBS we all learned. Now in a case of celiac, if you take the jejunal biopsy, lamina propria will be showing a lot of lymphocytic infiltration. That is the reason it is an autoimmune phenomena, and once you identify what are the sensitizing food and remove that from his food, that can lead to development of the recovery of the morphology once more back to normal. So typically patient presents with a chronic itchy rash which can be papular, which can be vesicular, beginning in the 20 years of age. That is the typical dermatitis herpetiformis with which it is typically associated.